Okay, welcome to Chapter 12. We're going to answer two questions in this chapter. First of all, what are the most important groups of eukaryotic microbes and their general characteristics? And then secondly, what are the key genera of fungi, algae, and protozoans and their essential characteristics? Chapter 12, if you haven't gathered already, is about eukaryotic microbes and their diversity and characteristics. So these are the players: the fungi, the algae, and in the algae group I'm including water molds, which are not fungi, they're not molds. Genetically, evolutionarily, they are algae. Protozoans, and those first three groups are the major ones that I've talked about so far. Slime molds are also going to be mentioned at the end of the lecture. They are in the kingdom Protista, and we're including them here because they are similar to fungi, not actually fungi, often considered microorganisms. Okay, first of all, the fungi, domain Eukarya, kingdom fungi. These are the awesomest of all of the microorganisms. And I say that because they're my own personal study organisms. Look how awesome they are. This picture here is from a lab conducted by microbiology students about 7 years ago when they made yogurt. And then the TA left the yogurt sitting out for a couple of days on a cart in the lab. And look at all the beautiful fungi that colonized the yogurt. This is pretty interesting because it tells you that fungi are all around us, floating through the air in the form of spores. That's one of the key characteristics of fungi, is that they disperse as spores. And they'll get into anything if you leave it sitting out. There are a few bacteria in here. On the bottom left there especially, you can see some white and red sort of slimy looking bacteria. Fungi look softer and more velvety. I'm sure you've seen some of these now in your lab. So what are some key characteristics of the fungi, domain Eukarya, kingdom fungi? Well, first of all, a little bit of vocabulary. The study of fungi is called mycology, MYC. And you might have guessed that because a couple of days ago we talked about how MYC means fungi. Fungi are eukaryotic, so think about what defines a eukaryote, and those characteristics are true of the fungi as well. So they have a true nucleus with chromosomes that are surrounded by a membrane, and then they have other membrane-bound organelles as well. All fungi are chemoheterotrophs. Chemoheterotrophy is something that we talked about in the metabolism lecture, and you should remember what that is now. And if you don't remember, go ahead and review that. Fungi have absorptive nutrition, which means that functionally what happens is that they exude enzymes into the environment around them. The enzymes break down complex molecules into simpler ones, and then they absorb those simple molecules. They absorb them. That's why it's absorptive nutrition. And that absorptive nutrition is facilitated by their structure, which is to be really, really small and narrow, which means that they have a really high surface area for absorption. Another characteristic of fungi that's important is that they reproduce through spores. They can do that sexually or asexually. The key is that they make spores, which are single cells that typically float through the air to allow fungi to get from one place to another. Their cell walls are made of chitin. That's something that we've talked about before. Okay, a couple of arguments economically about why you should care about fungi. First of all, there are some beneficial effects of fungi. We learned just in Chapter 9 that Saccharomyces is really important for biotechnology as a eukaryotic carrier of genes. Saccharomyces, the yeast, is also used in food production, such as bread and wine and beer. Also, there's a fungus called entomophaga, which is important for control of insects. There's a pest insect called gypsy moth that can defoliate whole trees in a matter of days. There's a fungus called entomophaga that eats the gypsy moth, and this fungus has been used extensively to try to control gypsy moth outbreaks. And then there's a fungus called Taxomyces, which it turns out produces a chemical called Taxol, which is a useful anti-cancer drug. On the other hand, there are some fungi that are not so convenient for us that have negative effects. For example, lots of fungi are involved in food spoilage. There are fungi involved in really nasty tree diseases, including chestnut blight and Dutch elm disease, which have basically wiped out all the chestnut and elm trees in the northeastern United States. We used to have a lot of chestnut trees around here until the chestnut blight fungus came through and killed them all. And then finally, there are several fungi that cause important human diseases. These are not terribly common diseases, most of them, but they can be really important. And we'll talk about those in more detail after the next midterm exam. Okay, a few more details about fungi. First of all, what is a fungus made of? Well, the body of the fungus is called the mycelium. A mycelium, that's the fill in the blank there, mycelium. A mycelium is made of a whole bunch of hyphae. Hyphae are strings of fungal cells. I'll show you some pictures of those on the next slide, but a description of them would be that they're long and narrow and they grow end to end. And they're really small and skinny. How small and skinny do you think they are? Here's a question, and this is a reminder. For whenever a clicker question comes up in this lecture, go ahead and write down what you think is the correct answer. And you're going to need to go to Blackboard after you're done watching the lecture and take a quiz on Blackboard. In order to get full credit for this quiz, you need to answer all the questions correctly. So if you get something wrong on Blackboard, you'll have a chance to go back and try again. You should be able to get all these questions correct by studying the lecture and correcting your answers if you get them wrong. So, how narrow do you think hyphae are? 0 to 1 micron, 1 to 10, 10 to 100 microns, or 100 to 1,000? Alright, since I haven't actually told you the answer to this one yet, I'm going to go ahead and give it to you now. And that is number 2, 1 to 10 microns, and it's usually closer to 1. 1 micron is about the right size for a fungal hypha. These are pretty small. Remember that a micron is a micrometer or a thousandth of a millimeter. That's like this big, which is very, very small. You can't see it with your naked eye. So if you can see a fungus, it's because they've woven together hundreds or thousands of those into a structure that you can see with your eyes. Pardon me, I'm going to let my dog out of this door behind me here. Okay, a little bit more about fungal hyphae. Here are a couple of pictures. On the bottom left is a really nice picture that shows the structure of hyphae. And you can see the individual cells. Do you see those cross walls that separate adjacent cells? That's what fungal hyphae look like. On the bottom right is an example of hyphae that don't have those cross walls between their cells, so you can't really see the individual cells, but they're there. And as I mentioned, hyphae are very small, less than 10 microns, usually closer to 1 micron. However, mycelia, which, remember, mycelium is a whole bunch of fungal hyphae woven together, those can be very, very large, even from meters to kilometers in size. That's right, some mycelia can be kilometers long. They've been woven together, and they've grown for years and years and years, and they can get to be kilometers long. These are some of the largest organisms, if not the largest organisms in the world. In fact, little known fact is that fungi are thought to be immortal, and that if we didn't kill them ourselves or something else didn't kill them, they could just live forever. Okay, one thing I need to mention about hyphae is to remind you that the structure of hyphae is important for their absorptive nutrition. If you look at how narrow they are and long, that gives them a really high surface to volume ratio. That high surface area allows them to absorb nutrients from the soil really efficiently, or from other substrates besides the soil. Okay, now at this point I have to mention something that we've talked about before, which is that not all fungi look like the ones we were just looking at. Some of them are yeasts, and yeasts are unicellular fungi. They're made up of just one cell. There are some weird yeasts called fission yeasts that divide in half, just like bacteria, symmetrically, kind of like binary fission. But most yeasts are budding yeasts, and they divide asymmetrically where there's a large one, and then they make a little baby off to the side that pinches off and then grows to full size. So which kind of those is pictured below? If you said to yourself just now, Dr. Hooksma, those are budding yeasts pictured below, then you were correct. Okay, now I've told you that there are fungi that grow in a mycelium. There are fungi that are yeasts, but in fact there are some fungi that are both, and these fungi are called dimorphic. Di means two, and morphic or morph means form, and these fungi grow both in both forms. Many of them are pathogens that attack animals. When they do that, they're usually growing like a yeast. So these pathogenic fungi grow like a yeast at 37 degrees Celsius. What does 37 degrees Celsius remind you of? What is that temperature? That's right, it's human body temperature. 37 degrees Celsius is human body temperature. Sorry for the interruption. And those fungi, those same fungi, grow like a mold or a mycelium at 25 degrees Celsius when they're out in the environment, like at room temperature. This might be when they're growing in your shed, in your barn, eating chicken poop, which is what they often do. So, what form do they grow in the human body? They grow as a yeast in the human body. What happens is that when they're growing out in the environment, eating chicken poop, they grow as a mycelium, but then they make spores, and those spores float up into the air, and then you breathe them in, and often what happens is you get a lung infection. And then when those fungi find themselves at 37 degrees Celsius, they grow like a mold or a mycelium and cause disease. Okay, now we need to take a side note here and discuss mitosis and meiosis. I've mentioned mitosis a little bit as a form of copying, as a way to copy a cell. If you are a eukaryote, you might copy your cell, you would copy your cell using mitosis. I mentioned the main thing I said about it before is that it's more complicated than binary fission. Binary fission is the really simple cell division process that bacteria use where they just copy their DNA, split in half, and they're done. Well, mitosis is a little bit more complicated because usually there's multiple chromosomes involved. Each chromosome copies itself, and you can see the red and blue chromosomes there on the top right that are copies of each other. Those are paired chromosomes because this is a diploid organism that already has, it starts out with two copies of a chromosome. Now, if this cell wants to replicate itself, each of those chromosomes that's in that pair needs to make a copy. And when they do that, they look like these little X's. Then when the cell gets ready to split, those X's line up along the center of the cell, at the center plane of the cell, along these protein highways. Then they split in half, and each half of the X goes one way or the other. Then the cell splits in half, and now each of those cells has a copy of each chromosome. Both of them are called diploid because they both have two copies of each cell. A lot of eukaryotes are diploid with two copies of each chromosome, and that's what's shown here. That's one distinctive thing about mitosis, is that it doesn't change the ploidy level of a cell. If a cell starts out as diploid and goes through mitosis, you make identical copies of that cell, both of which are also diploid. Diploid means it has two copies of each chromosome. The di at the beginning means di, the di, that means two, and that refers to the fact that there are two copies of each chromosome. Meiosis, on the other hand, shown on the left here, that's not true of meiosis. If you start out with a diploid cell, you end up with cells that have half the number of chromosomes, which is haploid. Haploid cells have only one chromosome, one copy of each chromosome. So you can see at the top we have a diploid cell with 2 copies of a chromosome. At the bottom you end up with 4 cells, all of which are haploid. So that's one key distinction between mitosis and meiosis. They're both cell division processes where you get more cells from one, but meiosis uniquely produces haploid cells from diploid. The other thing that's really important about meiosis is that the daughter cells that result at the bottom here are genetically variable. They're not the same as each other, and they're not the same as the parent cell. Look over at mitosis and you can see that the daughter cells that result are genetically identical. Those chromosomes are the same as the ones that started out. With meiosis, you have 4 cells that result, and they're all genetically distinct from each other and from the chromosomes in the parent cell. You don't need to know the intimate details of why that's true, except that I want you to know that when the chromosomes get ready to move into the daughter cells, they line up in the center and they exchange bits and pieces of each other to each other. So the chromosomes actually cross over and split and exchange little pieces, and then the new chromosomes that result are different than the original ones. So in a nutshell, meiosis results in, if you start out with diploid cells with 2 copies of each chromosome, you end up with haploid cells that only have 1 copy, and those are genetically variable. Okay, so with that background, what I want to talk about is fungal life cycles, and the fact that some life cycles are sexual and some are asexual. And one key point here is that sexual life cycles in fungi and in all eukaryotes, sexual life cycles involve meiosis. So what does that mean? Well, the result of meiosis then has to be that there are genetically variable offspring. If meiosis is involved, that means there's genetic variation that is produced. And in fact, that's true here. So if you look at the bottom at that, let's go ahead and look at in the middle here where this mycelium is. That mycelium grows, and if it encounters another mycelium of a different type, now fungi don't have males and females, they just have plus or minus types, different sexual types. If they encounter each other, they may have sex, which means for fungi that the cells merge and their 2 nuclei coexist for a little while in the same cell, and then they merge and form briefly, very briefly, they form a diploid cell that has a diploid nucleus with 2 copies of each chromosome. After that, they immediately go through meiosis. So what happens with meiosis, remember, if you have a diploid cell, what happens after that? Well, with meiosis, you end up with haploid cells that are genetically different from the parent and from each other. And in fact, the spores that result from meiosis are genetically variable from each other and from their parents. And in fact, spores are the main reproductive result of fungal reproduction. Spores of fungi, remember, are single-celled offspring of fungi that allow them to travel from one place to another and reproduce. A single spore is a single cell of a fungus that can travel through the air and land, and then it can germinate and grow into a hyphae and ultimately into a mycelium. Okay, now how is that different from an asexual reproductive cycle? Well, on the right, asexual reproduction is shown, and that is really simple. It's just that the cells of the fungus go through mitosis. So every cell that results from that cell division is genetically identical to the previous cell, It has the same ploidy level, so if it's haploid, the offspring are haploid. If it starts out diploid, the offspring are diploid. And they can make spores this way. So see those little conidia that are labeled there? C-O-N-I-D-I-A. Those are spores, shown also in the photo on the top right, that are haploid. But what's really important is that they're all genetically identical to each other, and they're genetically identical to the mycelium that produced them. And why is that? That's because they resulted from mitosis. Mitosis is all you need for asexual reproduction. Asexual means not sexual. So there's no two genetic types coming together and having sex and going through meiosis, which is what we see on the left, but rather just mitosis. And then those conidia, those asexual spores, are released into the air, where they can fly to a new place, and one of them might germinate and produce new hyphae, which grows into a new mycelium. Okay, that's kind of a generalized fungal life cycle. Some fungi do both of those things, and some focus on one or the other. If fungi go through sexual reproduction, which is shown on the left, it often takes place in a mushroom. So what a mushroom is it's a sexual structure of fungi. If you are eating a mushroom, looking at a mushroom, you're kind of watching fungal sex take place. Mushrooms are also called sporocarps. Okay, a couple of notes about fungal taxonomy. First of all, fungal taxonomy is in major flux, which means that scientists are still actively trying to figure out how fungi should be named, how they're related to each other, and which ones are most closely related to each other and other organisms. In this class, we're just going to talk about two major groups of fungi, two major phyla. One of them is Ascomycota, and the other one is Basidiomycota. A quick note, which is that there's a phylum that used to be called Zygomycota, and that doesn't exist anymore. You might still see reference to it, but I want you to know that it has been deconstructed by scientists because it didn't make sense. Okay, a couple of notes about phylum Ascomycota. These are sometimes called the sac fungi because they have sex, and then they put their resulting sexual spores into little bags or sacs called asci, A-S-C-I. That's the plural for ascus. That's what these fungi are named after. The Ascomycota are the ascus-producing fungi. Down on the bottom right here, you can see a picture. They're sort of hot dog shaped. Those are big bags full of 8 spores that are all sexual spores, meaning they resulted from meiosis. These fungi have septate hyphae, which mean they have cross walls between their cells. They produce sexual ascospores, as I just mentioned, but they also very frequently will go through asexual reproduction and make asexual spores called conidia, like we just talked about a few minutes ago. So this is an example of a group of fungi that does both sexual and asexual reproduction. Okay, you need to know 3 key genera from this phylum: Aspergillus, Penicillium, and Saccharomyces. We'll talk briefly about each of them here now. Aspergillus and Penicillium we're going to talk about together because they're very similar. Both of them are opportunistic pathogens in immunocompromised patients, and they're also used in food production. Opportunistic pathogen is a term that I introduced a couple of lectures ago. That means a fungus that doesn't have to be a pathogen, it doesn't have to cause disease, but when it finds itself encountering a weak individual, a person with a weakened immune system due to a disease like AIDS, or maybe because of a kind of cancer, or they're taking drugs to suppress their immune system, then it can cause disease. In fact, AIDS patients used to frequently die from Aspergillus or Penicillium infections, not from the virus HIV itself. These fungi are also used in food production, as I mentioned, especially in making cheeses. They are responsible for fermenting simple, tasteless cheeses into really interesting, stinky cheeses. Penicillium, of course, is also the original source of the drug called penicillin, and it makes a greenish mold that is really recognizable on food and other substrates. That green color is what you see in blue cheese, the little blue-green mottling in the cheese. Also, it looks like this on the bottom right. Those are conidia. Those are asexual spores. So when you see that blue-green color, those are asexual spores produced by the penicillium. Okay, a couple of notes about Saccharomyces, the yeast. Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the main eukaryotic host used in recombinant DNA biotechnology, as you know from Chapter 9. And it's also used in making wine, bread, and beer, as we've also talked about previously. Okay, just a quick review. What is the metabolic process that is important for this food production process? You may recall that that is fermentation. Okay, a couple of pictures for you. Here are some. This is a blown up version of that photo showing asexual reproduction in penicillium. There's a moldy orange. The blue-green color is a whole bunch of conidia, probably millions of them. And then if you zoom in really close, you see the image on the right, which are a bunch of conidia attached to a conidia-4, which is a spore-producing structure. Here are some examples of mushrooms where sexual reproduction takes place in these fungi. On the top left is a cup fungus, bottom left is a truffle, and on the right is a really delicious fungus called the morel. Okay, the next phylum of the fungi that you need to know is phylum Basidiomycota. Phylum Basidiomycota are called the club fungi, and they're named for their sexual spore-bearing structures as well, which are called basidia, B-A-S-I-D-I-A. They look kind of like clubs that have spores attached to them, and that's why these are called the club fungi. These fungi also have septate hyphae, and they produce sexual basidiospores. One difference between these and the Ascomycota is that they only rarely produce asexual spores. Key genera that you need to know of these fungi are Agaricus, which represent most of the store-bought mushrooms that you eat, including the white button mushrooms, cremini mushrooms, and portobello mushrooms, and then Amanita, which are mostly poisonous mushrooms. Here's a diagram of the Basidiomycete life cycle, and on the right is shown an asexual reproductive stage, but these fungi don't make asexual spores. They can reproduce asexually by just going through mitosis and making more and more cells, and they can break into multiple pieces, and each of those pieces can grow into a new fungus. But mainly the way that they reproduce is shown on the left, and that is sexually. And this is the same as the life cycle I showed you before, except that the meiosis is taking place in the mushroom. Specifically, it's in the gills of the mushroom on the underside of the cap. And that's where the two nuclei in each cell join with each other to form a zygote, which is diploid. And then those cells go through meiosis and result in haploid, genetically variable spores. This is a picture of mushroom gills and their attached basidia and basidiospores. So on the bottom of these mushroom caps on the left are gills. On the right is shown a gill with basidia attached. So you can see the basidia, which are these club-shaped structures sticking off to the right that have spores attached to them. And those are sexual spores. Okay, a couple of notes about spores, and that is that spores allow the dispersal of fungi, usually through the air. In Basidiomycetes, the spores are shot from basidia into the air, where they may be picked up by wind currents. And there's a link to a video that you can watch on your own time. On the bottom left is shown a puffball. Puffballs have huge masses of spores that are released when animals step on them. This is a picture of agaricus mushrooms, which are the store-bought mushrooms. They're grown in big bags of compost, as shown on the right there, in warehouses, and then you eat them on pasta. The same mushroom species is responsible for cremini mushrooms, white button mushrooms, and also portobello mushrooms. They just grow them a little bit differently to produce those three species, those three kinds of mushrooms. And then this is a picture of Amanita. Amanita is the poisonous mushroom that you need to know about from this phylum. And Amanita is famous. It's maybe the most famous mushroom in the history of Earth. It was found in cave paintings in Italy from early civilizations. It was made famous more recently in the Super Mario Brothers video game. And it's also thought to be responsible for Santa Claus by some people. The reason for that is that Amanita is hallucinogenic. If you eat some of it, you may or may not have strong, vivid, euphoric dreams. And this is a mushroom then that has been used by people over the centuries as a religious or recreational drug. The people in Siberia are said to have used this drug recreationally and to have observed deer, specifically their local deer, which were reindeer, eating this mushroom and acting crazy as well. And if you're hallucinating and you have a red and white mushroom and you see reindeer jumping around and acting funny, you can imagine that you might come up with the idea of a Santa Claus dressed in red and white, flying through the air, being pulled by a sleigh, pulled in a sleigh by flying reindeer. Okay, a quick note about this thing here, which is called a fairy ring. Circles of mushrooms like this are often referred to as fairy rings, and what I want you to know about fairy rings is that these are just the reproductive structures of the mushroom. The body of the fungus is in the soil underneath the grass. What happened is that in the very center of this circle, a single spore landed and germinated, and then that fungus grew out in a circle, eating food along the way, and when it had eaten enough, it made mushrooms along the edge, and that's why you get these big circles of mushrooms. Okay, a couple of quiz questions, and now this is to remind you that when I'm showing you quiz questions, I'm not going to tell you the answers, and you're going to need to write down what you think is the correct answer, and then go to Blackboard after you're done watching the lecture and finish the quiz there. And you're going to need to get all of the answers to the quiz correct in order to get full credit for that lecture quiz. So here's the next question. Which phylum of fungi is known as the club fungi? And then a true-false question. All fungi are heterotrophic. True or false? Another fungus question. Most yeasts, such as Saccharomyces, reproduce by an uneven asymmetrical cell division process called what? Fission, dimorphism, budding, or meiosis? What kind of nutrition do fungi exhibit? Okay, now a couple of more additional notes about fungi. First of all, fungi have three main ecological strategies. The first one is to be a decomposer or saprobe. Most fungi, in fact, are decomposers. These fungi utilize excreted enzymes to break down complex molecules in dead organic matter, and that's the key. A decomposer is an organism that eats dead stuff, dead organic matter. Some fungi are pathogens. They cause diseases. They attack living organisms. And then the third strategy is to be a mutualist. M-U-T-U-A-L-I-S-T. Some fungi are mutualists with plants or algae, and they get their food by trading with plants or algae. All fungi need to get energy and organic carbon molecules. Decomposers get it by eating dead organic matter. Pathogens get it by eating living organic matter, and mutualists get it by trading with living organisms. All of them, however, are chemoheterotrophs. Okay, here's a picture of decomposer fungi eating a dead log in the forest. The mushrooms are popping out. Those, remember, are the sexual structures. But picture, where is the body of the fungus? The body of the fungus is inside the log, eating the wood. Mushrooms are like fruit on the tree. You can pick them, but the main body of the fungus is still there, doing what it does, which is eating dead stuff here in this case. Okay, here's a couple pictures for pathogenic fungi. Many of them are plant pathogens. On the left, you can see a rust fungus eating this wheat. On the right, you can see an ergot, which is this black fungus eating the seeds of a rye plant. And then there are several diseases in humans, as I mentioned before. A lot of those have the name mycosis, and we'll talk about some of those diseases after the next midterm exam. And at the very bottom here is linked a really interesting video that you need to watch and take notes on about cordyceps, which is a pathogenic fungi, a fungus that attacks insects. Okay, now I mentioned decomposers, I mentioned pathogens. The third strategy is to be a mutualist. One kind of mutualism is a lichen, L-I-C-H-E-N-S. Lichens are a mutualism between a fungus, typically an ascomycete fungus from the phylum Ascomycota. Partnership between one of those fungi and a photosynthetic organism, usually an algae, usually an alga, sometimes a cyanobacterium, but almost always an algae. Now, in this case, what benefits does each partner receive? Well, each partner in a lichen receives a benefit from the other. The photosynthetic partner, the algae usually, is photosynthesizing, and so they're making lots of sugars. That's what they give to the fungus. And this is always going to be true of partnerships for fungi. They usually partner with a photosynthetic organism that gives them sugars. In return, what do you think the fungus gives back to the photosynthetic partner, the algae in this case? Well, fungi are really good at getting nutrients out of the soil and off of rocks and other difficult substrates. They absorb those nutrients and then they give some of them to the photosynthetic partner. You can see on the left what these look like when they're growing on trees. There's 3 different kinds there, a foliose one, a fruticose one, and a crustose one. They can be really pretty looking. They grow really commonly around here on trees in the grove, for example. On the right is a diagram showing a sideways section, a cut through a lichen. And if you look really close, you can see the algae, which are single-celled algae. They're microscopic. Most of the body of a lichen is fungus, but they have a layer of algae growing inside them. And you'll look at these in the lab next week or the week after. Here are a couple of pictures of lichens growing on harsh habitats. In this case, it's rocks on a volcanic island in the Pacific Ocean. All of those different colors on those rocks are different kinds of lichens, different fungi and different algae. All right, and then the final strategy is also a mutualism. Remember, the third strategy is to be a mutualist. You can be a mutualism as a lichen, or fungi can be in a mutualism called mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae are mutualisms between fungi and plant roots. In this case, it's very similar to lichens. You have a fungus and a photosynthetic partner. In this case, the photosynthetic partner is a plant instead of an algae. Also, you can see the plant. In the case of the lichen, it was a microscopic algae. Here it's a big plant. But the relationship is the same. The plant here is the photosynthetic partner, so it provides carbon in the form of sugars, carbohydrates, and in return the fungus provides nutrients to the plant. The fungi grow from the roots of the plant out into the soil in this case, and they absorb nutrients from the soil and provide those nutrients to the plant. Many of these fungi that are mycorrhizal associate with plants are responsible for the mushrooms that you see growing in the woods. Mushrooms then would be the sexual reproductive structures of these fungi. Okay, a couple of more questions about fungi. Which phylum of fungi reproduces mostly by sexual reproduction and only rarely by asexual reproduction? Next, lichens consist of a mutualistic relationship between what and what? Okay, here I'm going to give you a mnemonic device to remember this one. My brother used to lead hikes in Alaska with tourists, and he would tell them about lichens, and he would use this little jingle, which is that Freddie Fungus and Alice Algae took a liken to each other, but now their marriage is on the rocks. So the answer is fungi and algae. Freddie Fungus and Alice Algae took a liken to each other. Okay, what is a mycorrhizae? Mycorrhizae consist of a mutualistic relationship between what and what? In both lichens and mycorrhizae, what does the fungal partner receive from the photosynthetic partner? Lichens and mycorrhizae look very different, but they're really functionally very similar. It's a partnership between a fungus and a photosynthetic partner, either an algae or a plant. In both cases, what does the photosynthetic partner, the algae or the plant, give to the fungus? Is it nutrients? Is it carbon? Is it a place to live? Is it proteins? Okay, what is the most common ecological strategy of fungi? Is it to be a plant pathogen, an animal pathogen, a mutualistic symbiont, or a decomposer? All right, now we've talked about fungi, which is the group we're going to spend the most time on today. We have two groups left of eukaryotic microorganisms, the algae and the protozoans, and then a small group called the slime molds. At this point, we've been talking quite a bit. I might suggest that you click pause and take a break, and then come back refreshed and excited about eukaryotic microbes. Okay, welcome back. We're going to talk about algae. So algae are found in domain Eukarya, just like the fungi, and they are in the kingdom Protista. Protista, remember, is a kingdom that really doesn't mean anything. It is a grab bag of different organisms that they didn't know where to put, so they put them in the Protista together, but they're really not necessarily closely related to each other. Algae can be unicellular or multicellular, kind of like fungi. Most of them are photoautotrophs, with very few exceptions. The exception would be the water molds, or oomycetes. And we'll talk about those first of all here. Oomycota, or water molds, are strange organisms. Their closest relatives are algae. They're essentially algae genetically and evolutionarily. One bit of evidence for that is that their cell walls are made of cellulose, just like algae and plants. However, and not chitin like fungi. However, they look and act a lot like fungi. They're multicellular and chemoheterotrophic like fungi. Many of them are decomposers, just like fungi. Some of them are parasites, like fungi are, of plants and animals. For example, the Irish potato blight was maybe the most important plant disease in history, because it caused a major potato famine in Ireland and caused many Irish people to move to the United States. If any of you have Irish ancestry, you might be here today because of the Irish potato blight. There's a disease called sudden oak death in California caused by a water mold. The picture on the top right is a fish that is infected with a water mold disease. Okay, so water molds are called molds, but they're not fungi. They're really algae. All right, now the real algae. This diagram here shows the habitats of algae. Look on the top right and you can see green algae, cyanobacteria, and euglenoids. Cyanobacteria and euglenoids are not algae. Green algae, though, are algae, and they're found on land in wet areas, creeks, streams, wet soil, rivers, lakes, unicellular green algae especially. Multicellular green algae, moving down and to the left, are found in the shores of the ocean in shallow water. Then if you move deeper into cold water, you find brown algae, which are macroscopic. They're big multicellular organisms. If you move out into the shallow water of the ocean, you will find unicellular green algae, another kind of algae called diatoms, and then another kind of algae called dinoflagellates. We'll talk about each of these in detail in a minute. And then go deeper and you will find red algae. Okay, first a couple of notes about diatoms. Diatoms are really abundant algae in shallow waters of oceans and also lakes and streams and rivers. What's unique about them is that their cell walls are made of pectin, which is a waxy substance, and silica, which is essentially glass. And they have two halves of their cells that are stuck together like petri dishes, in that they have a smaller one that nests inside a larger one. They are unicellular, that's just one cell, and they're photosynthetic like other algae. One thing that is distinctive about them is their color. They usually have this sort of yellow-brown color. They're not bright green like green algae. They're this yellow-brown color. And also they often look kind of symmetrical, and look sort of like snowflakes with really fine, interesting patterns, or like you're looking through a kaleidoscope. Green algae have cellulose cell walls, just like plants. And they, in fact, are the closest living relatives of plants. Green algae can be unicellular or multicellular, kind of like fungi. They have pigments and carbohydrate storage compounds that are very similar to plants also. And as I said, they are the closest living relatives of land plants. Here are some pictures of green algae. On the top left is the simplest ones. These are single cells with no flagella. They just float around and photosynthesize. In the middle is a green algae that has flagella. They can swim, as can any microbe that has flagella. Some algae are colonial, like the ones on the top right. They have like little balls of algae growing inside other balls of algae, and they pop these little balls out, and those go off and make more little balls. On the bottom right are some that look really fascinating because they kind of look like snowflakes, a lot like diatoms, except these are green rather than that yellow-brown color. And then some green algae are colonial and string-like, as shown on the bottom left. A little bit about the life cycle of a unicellular green algae. Like fungi, these algae can go through either sexual or asexual reproduction. And it's a very similar concept. On the right, with asexual reproduction, all that's required is mitosis. The cell splits in half, copying its chromosomes exactly, and you get, as a result, two cells that are identical to each other and identical to the parent cell. They're the same ploidy, so they have, if the parent cell was haploid, you get two haploid cells with only one copy of each chromosome. And if the parent cell was diploid, with two copies of each chromosome, the result is diploid daughter cells that are identical with each with two copies. On the left is sexual reproduction, which requires meiosis. That also requires two cells merging in a sexual reproductive act, and they form a zygote. Those two cells that mate with each other are haploid, but they make a diploid zygote, which goes through meiosis and produces haploid offspring that are genetically diverse and different from the parents. Red algae also have cellulose cell walls. Most of them are multicellular, growing as pretty large organisms in the ocean, mostly in deeper ocean waters. They are red because they reflect red light. They absorb the blue and green lights that get to the deeper waters of the ocean. The ocean water filters out a lot of other kinds of light. We harvest red algae from the ocean to get agar and a substance called carrageenan. Agar, we've talked about already, is used in making microbiology media. Carrageenan is a product that is used in food and makeup. It's used to homogenize and keep things homogenized. It helps solids stay suspended throughout a liquid. And if you look for it, you'll find it on food labels in ice cream and also on makeup and labels like that. As I mentioned, the red pigments in red algae allow the absorption of blue light from deep in the ocean. Brown algae I mention here because I want you to not be ignorant about all the kinds of algae, but these are not microorganisms. They don't have very much of their life that is microscopic. These are big multicellular organisms. They're often called kelp, K-E-L-P. All of them are multicellular, and you find these abundantly in cold coastal waters near the surface of the ocean. In these areas where lots of brown algae are growing, we call them kelp forests. This is another algae that we harvest, and from these algae we get a product called algin, which has very similar uses to carrageenan. And then a last type of algae that we need to talk about is the dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates are typical in some ways in that they are photosynthetic. They're all unicellular. Most of them are photosynthetic. Some of them, however, are mutualists with marine animals called corals. You've heard of corals. Corals involve a partnership that is beneficial to both an algae and to an animal. A mutualism is an interaction between two species that both benefit from the interaction. In corals, the algae are the photosynthetic partner. So what are they providing for the animal, do you think? I hope you said to yourself carbon in the form of sugars or carbohydrates of some kind. What is being provided by the animal? It's not well known, but probably nutrients. And then also some dinoflagellates are important to humans because they produce neurotoxins, toxins that interfere with human neurons that can cause diseases like paralytic shellfish poisoning that you might get from a raw oyster, for example. Those same toxins are being produced by algae when you hear about a red tide. Red tides sometimes end up with, causing closures of beaches because these dinoflagellates are blooming in the water, producing toxins that can make you very sick if you get in the water. Okay, a quick preview question for the protozoans, which are the next group. How do most protozoans obtain food? Do they absorb it? Do they engulf it, open up and eat it like an animal? Or do they photosynthesize it? Okay, general notes about protozoa. This is domain Eukarya, kingdom Protista, and these organisms are all unicellular without cell walls. Lacking a cell wall is one way in which they are like animals. Most of them are motile with either cilia or flagella. That's another way that they're like animals, that they can move around. And they're chemoheterotrophs that engulf their food. They engulf food like bacteria and particulate nutrients. And this is another way that they're like animals. Animals also engulf their food. They open up and eat their food. A few species of protozoans have big health impacts or economic impacts. Not a lot. One group that you need to know about of protozoans is the ciliates, or phylum Ciliophora. These move using cilia, little tiny structures on the surface of their cell. We learned about these in a previous lecture. They have complex cell structures with multiple organelles. And one that you need to know about is Balantidium coli. This is the only protozoan that is a human parasite, and it causes severe diarrhea. The key genus, though, that I want you to know is Paramecium. Paramecium is the representative genus of the ciliates. Paramecium is pictured here. It's usually an oval shape, and it moves around really fast. You often can't see the cilia in pictures, but you know they're there. So if it's oval shaped, and it doesn't have a strong color like green, and it's zipping around really fast, it's probably Paramecium. That's Paramecium. Okay, the next phylum you need to know about is Euglenozoa. Euglenozoa moves around as well, but by flagella. Some of them are also pathogens. There's one called Trypanosoma that causes African sleeping sickness. It's transmitted by tsetse flies. Some of them are facultative photoautotrophs, which means that not only can they do chemoheterotrophy, but they can also do photoautotrophy, where they photosynthesize their food. The key genus that does this that you need to know about is Euglena, Euglena. And there's one pictured on the bottom right here, a cartoon. These are oval-shaped, like Paramecium, but they're green, and that's what makes them distinctive from Paramecium. They zip around really fast as well, and you often can't see the flagella under the microscope, but you know they have one because they're moving. You can follow this link if you want to see a video with Euglena. And on the right here is a picture of what they look like. Those ones there are packed with chloroplasts, which are the photosynthetic organelles. Okay, a couple of examples of disease-causing protozoans. Giardia lamblia is a protozoan that causes severe diarrhea. It's caught from contaminated water. If you're out in the wilderness and you think that the water looks really clean and you drink it and you get sick, it's probably because Giardia were in there, probably because deer were pooping in the water and then you drank the water. These are transmitted from animals like deer, and they get into your gut and they attach to your gut lining and they cause diarrhea. And we'll talk more about this one next week. Other disease-causing protozoans include amoebas. Amoebas, one thing that's unique about them is that they are little blobs that can stick parts of themselves out like a little foot, which is called a pseudopod. And they can use those to move around and sort of pull themselves through the water. Many of them don't cause diseases, they just go around eating smaller microbes. These are pretty big for microbes, often up to 0.5 millimeter. And they go around eating things like bacteria and smaller protozoans. About 10% of humans have an amoeba in their body called Entamoeba histolytica, which sometimes causes disease, but often doesn't. So about 1 in 10 of you have this amoeba in you, and it's not causing you any trouble at all. Here's a picture of an amoeba showing the pseudopods, the little feet that are sticking out. And look at the scale, 100 microns there. If you use that to calculate how big this thing is, that's nearly 1 millimeter across. That's a gigantic microorganism. Okay, last but not least, the slime molds. Slime molds are domain Eukarya, kingdom Protista, but they're not fungi, despite their name. There are two kinds of slime molds. There's the cellular slime molds, which are aggregations of individual amoebas that eat bacteria. They're called cellular because they get together sometimes to make kind of a macroscopic structure, but they retain their little cellular structures. They don't merge and become one cell. In contrast, the second one here is plasmodial slime molds. That's Plasmodial. Those slime molds are composed of multiple amoeba that get together and lose their individuality, and they form a single large cell called a plasmodium. So the cellular slime mold has a life cycle like this. If you start with number 1 there's an amoeba. And the odd thing about these guys is that They can be moving along, doing just fine, but then all of a sudden they start signaling to each other using a molecule called cyclic AMP. And that signaling molecule tells everyone, okay, let's get together and grow together, but not lose our individuality. Let's just get together and form a little slug on the bottom left. And then let's crawl around with that slug. And then at some point they stop and they make a little stalk and they make spores. And all of this is asexual. They just use mitosis to make some spores, and those spores can each grow into a new amoeba. The bottom right is a link you can watch to a video you can watch. Plasmodial slime molds do not retain their individuality. It's a very similar life cycle, except it involves sexual reproduction. Two amoebas get together, they make a zygote, which is diploid. You have meiosis, which results in haploid offspring. But those haploid offspring merge and form one big multinucleate plasmodium, which is a big cell with lots of nuclei in a bag. That plasmodium can grow like a fungus and eat food, and then at some point it makes spores, and each of those spores makes an individual amoeba, and it starts all over again. And at the bottom right is a link that you can watch that shows you an example of one of these. Here's a picture of the most common plasmodial slime mold that you'll see around Oxford. It is pretty common in fresh wood chips in the fall and sometimes in the spring. It's called the dog vomit slime mold for obvious reasons. It's kind of crusty looking. If you touch it though, it's usually poofy. It poofs the spores out into the air. And watch for this in beds of wood chips. Okay, a couple of clicker questions to finish. Organisms responsible for Irish potato blight and sub-note death belong to what group? Fungi, algae, lichens, or protozoans? True or false, cellular slime molds are composed of multiple nuclei in a single large cell? Or is that plasmodial that's describing? Which type of alga is typically harvested for agar and carrageenan? Is that water molds, brown algae, red algae, or green algae? And then which type of alga has cell walls made of silica, glass, that are in two parts like a petri dish? Dinoflagellates, diatoms, red algae, or green algae? Which type of protozoans move by extending pseudopods? Are these amoebas, euglenoids, ciliates, plasmodia, or giardia? In the coral symbiosis, what does the photosynthetic partner, the dinoflagellate, provide to the animal host? Is it nutrients, shelter, carbohydrates, or disease protection? Which group of algae is responsible for red tides and paralytic shellfish poisoning? Is it red algae, green algae, diatoms, or dinoflagellates?